Hey, welcome to our introductory tutorial on the SPSS software program. Now, in this tutorial, we'll take a very basic look at how to just start entering data in SPSS. So how do we use this program? Okay, here in SPSS, notice first of all that when the software program is opened, we've got a spreadsheet-like grid here that we see. And in the rows of this spreadsheet, notice they all have numbers. Okay, so the rows have numbers, and the columns all have the word VAR, and so forth. This is the default name for a variable. VAR is just variable. And where a variable or a column and a row meet, this is called a cell. So we have each of these rectangles is known as a cell. There's two things we need to know or access when we create and enter data into SPSS. See these two tabs down here? We have the Data View tab and the Variable View tab. And we can click on each one. The Data View tab, first of all, has the gold background right now. That means it's the one that's currently shown in our window here. This is the Data View window. We could click on Variable View, and this is now the Variable View window. Notice how it's changed. The rows are still given by numbers, but the columns now don't say VAR. They have different names like name, type, width, decimals, and so on. Okay, let's go back to the Data View window for a minute, and the way we do that is by clicking on the Data View tab. So we click on that, and I see I'm back here where my columns say VAR and so forth. There's a few other things, like this menu bar here where we have lots of options, and we have these toolbar buttons as well. We'll be accessing these later, once again. But in this tutorial, I just want to enter a basic data set to get you comfortable with how to use the software, how to enter data into the software program, and how to create variables as well. So we're going to do have a very small data set to make things easy, to make things manageable. So I'm going to have the scores for 3 different people on 2 variables. And my first variable will be named exam score. So what I want to do is, since I'm going to, at this point I want to create a variable in SPSS, I'm going to go to the Variable View window. So how do I do that? Remember, I go down here to my tab, and I go to the Variable View tab, click on that. That brings up the Variable View window. Now under Name, click on this first cell in row 1, and I'm going to go ahead and type exam score. But what I typically like to do is I like to put an underscore in between my words. So if I press the Shift key and click on what looks like the hyphen or maybe dash key, that will make an underscore there. So I have exam score, and I press Enter. You may wonder, well, why don't you just use a space? Well, I'll show you. If I try to use a space here, like that, and I press Enter, notice I get an error message. Variable name contains an illegal character. In other words, in SPSS, there's a few restrictions when you want to create a variable. Some things you can't do. And one thing is you can't have any spaces involved. There's a few other things, like you can't use a number sign, and there's a few others as well, restrictions that don't really come into play for most people, because they don't use special characters or symbols when they're creating their variable names. So instead of a space, I like to use an underscore. Once again, if you want to just type exam score with no spaces, that's fine too. And then let's put our second variable into the Variable View window, and that's going to be GPA. So I'll click here in the cell under Name for row 2. I'm going to type this in all caps, GPA, and then I'll press Enter. Now notice in these columns, type both came up as numeric, width both came up as 8, decimal shows 2, and so forth. These are the default options that come up in SPSS. And in this tutorial, we're not going to worry about these right now. We'll just accept them as they came up. Okay, that's it for now. I've got my exam score variable created and my GPA score variable created. So now I'm done with the variable creation. So really, I'm done with the Variable View window. So now let's enter our data. And to do that, we want to go to the Data View tab. So click on the Data View tab. And now when you do that, you should see, instead of VAR, for the first 2 columns, now we have our variable names that we just created a moment ago in the Variable View window. So we have the name exam score, and then the variable name GPA in our first 2 columns, respectively. And here in SPSS, in the Data View window, the different rows typically are for different people. So for example, row 1, the first person's values on their exam or their exam score, and their GPA will be entered here. Then in row 2, we'll enter the values for the second person. So their exam score and their GPA will be entered here, and so forth. So let's go ahead and do this. For the first person, they got an 85 on their exam, so type 85 and then press enter. The second person got a 92 on their exam, so type that in and press enter. And then finally, the third person got a 72. So type that in, press enter. We can also use, as opposed to enter, we could use the arrow keys. So I'll use those now to move up to the first person's GPA. And as a quick note, if you see a period here, that's the way SPSS represents a missing value. That means SPSS thinks there's no value there and there should be one. And you know what? It's right. There should be a value under GPA, and we're going to enter it right now. When we do enter the value, the period will disappear. So the first person's GPA was 3.25, so go ahead and enter that in. This time let's use the down arrow key to scroll down. The second person's GPA is 3.45, so enter that in and press the down arrow key. And then finally, the last person's GPA is 2.53, so let's enter that in. Okay, then I'll press enter just for practice using a different key. So notice here, now I have my values in for my 3 people. I have their exam score and their GPA entered in. And that's really it for creating a basic data set in SPSS. Let's go ahead and do a basic analysis as well before we close this tutorial. So to do that, go to Analyze on the menu bar. This is called the menu bar. Select Analyze, go to Reports, and what I want to do is select Case Summaries. So go ahead and left-click on Case Summaries. Okay, now under Case Summaries, what we want to do is, notice in SPSS we have our variables we created on the left, and we want to move these to the right if we want to analyze them. So notice exam score is selected by default. I'm going to go ahead and click this right arrow button on the first arrow here, the arrow for variables box. Click that, it moves it over. Then I'm going to go back and select GPA by clicking on it once with the left mouse button. Click the right arrow button under variables once again, and that moves it to the variables box. Now we could select some of these options and so forth, click on statistics, click on options, but I just want to keep this very simple for this first tutorial. So we'll just go ahead and click OK. And when you do that, you'll see that a new window opens up in SPSS, and that window is called the Viewer window. Notice the name Viewer here. We'll call it the Viewer window, but we'll often refer to it as the Output window because it presents our output or the results of our analyses. Okay, so here in our basic output, we have this first table tells us for the variables exam score and GPA, we have 3 values that were included. We have 0 values that were excluded, and a total of 3 values. It doesn't really tell us a lot here, other than to say that all of our values were included in our analysis, all 3 of them. In the second table, Case Summaries, and notice here we have our 3 values, person 1, 2, and 3, and here's the values we just entered into the data set. The first person had an exam score of 85 and a GPA of 3.25. Second person had an exam score of 92 and a GPA of 3.45, and so on. And then our total N indicates the number of values that were analyzed. 3 values for exam score and 3 values for GPA were analyzed. Now finally, if we want to move back to our data editor window where we entered our data, we can either click on this here, notice it says Go to Data, or we can click on Window and go here to what's called the data editor as I just mentioned. Let's go ahead and do that. It brings me back to my data. Okay, this window, I didn't say it previously, it's called the data editor window, where we have 2 different views, the data view and the variable view. Okay, so once again, we create our variables by clicking on the variable view tab, as we did here, and then we enter our data by clicking on the data view tab, as we did here. This concludes the tutorial on entering basic values into SPSS.